See you.
Our last session, Micah, was with Donnie, and he said about he had been at the girls' bat mitzvah and blah, blah, blah. So that's why we know why you weren't here last time.
Oh, that's great. That's great.
And so welcome, everybody. We're going to get started in just a minute or two. We're just waiting to get people out of the waiting room and into the Zoom so we can all hear Micah from the start. I think we're good to start now.
We are. Okay.
I mean, they're still coming in, so start slow.
Okay. So good morning, everybody. First of all, Amy and Brian, thank you for organizing and hosting this always. You're great. You guys should definitely get married. What a 1-2 combination. Thank you for bringing us Hartman and the technology that makes it possible. Micah, we love you. It's so good to see you. Welcome to you. And I want to just thank all of our learners who are on the screen to check in with us this morning. It's such a great blessing to learn Torah with you. Micah is going to be talking that the concept here is when the going gets tough, we learn Torah. And what the concept was for this monthly series is let's take a look at books of the Hebrew Bible. They're in our canon. They're legit. They're Jewishy. And most Jews have never even opened these books, let alone studied them. So, for example, Daniel, most Jews have never read the book of Daniel. They've never read the book of Ezra. They've never read the book of Nehemiah. Some of you might have, but it's not commonly done. It's very uncommonly done. And there's a lot of meaning in these books. So we're going to be starting in a minute when Micah gets going with the book of Daniel. Tell us about it and what it means, what its pshat is, what it means in its own context, what it could mean to us. But before we do that, I just wanted to connect at the human level with our dear friend and teacher, Micah. I wanted to just surface a few things and ask him to tackle it in any order. One is his wife, Tzipi, works as a nurse, in treating COVID patients, and wanted to get an update about how she's doing, about how the hospital's doing, about how Israel's doing with COVID. Their daughters, Shiri and Avital, celebrated their B'nat Mitzvah with Parshat Noach. And I know there was a lot of fluidity about what they would be able to do, what kind of party, coronavirus there is also a problem. We want to know how their bat mitzvah was. And then finally, would just love some quick thinking from 30,000 feet about the Israeli reaction to our American presidential election. So Micah, if you could tackle those as kind of just to get into it and then start with the book of Daniel after that.
Great. First of all, Rabbi, it's great to be here, and it's great to be here with all of you. Zoom is not the real thing. It's just folks, we're in exile now. We're in exile. But God willing, we'll be seeing each other face to face. Maybe in a few months, maybe in a year. God knows. No one knows. But in the meantime, this is all we got, right? This is all we got. And I love the way the Rabbi framed it. When things are tough, we learn Torah. And a few weeks ago, I think the Rabbi challenged me and Amy to prepare some sessions about the books that no one reads. Daniel, Ezra, Nehemiah. And I love the challenge, and I love these books. And I hope today will be interesting. So you asked me about COVID in Israel. At least when I read the newspaper, things are a lot worse in the States. But it goes up and down. There's times where things are worse in the States and better in Israel, and sometimes it's better in Israel. Now Israel's in a good time, and America seems like, at least from what I read in the newspaper, and I know there's different town. I don't know how it is specifically where you guys are, right? But it seems like it's not so good there right now, COVID-wise. Am I right?
Yes.
Yeah. So I'm really, really sorry. And we're praying for you all, for your strength and your health. My wife is a COVID fighter. It's amazing. When it started, I was terrified that every day it's like a soldier. Like my image was, she's a soldier going to Lebanon, fighting Hezbollah, coming home every day. That was my image. And there is an enemy. It's a virus. She's the one out there fighting instead of us and for of us, and she comes home every time. And we were terrified. And now it's the new normal. That's the amazing thing. You get used to everything and anything. So, and she's brave, and we're happy. But you're right. The bigger deal is the bat mitzvah that we've just celebrated. The bat mitzvah, and what we did was for the bat mitzvah, we did two aliyahs. They had the aliyah to the Torah, which was in Parashat Noach, and they read both of them, the entire parasha. Did aliyah la Torah. It was very, very nice. And then that was Shabbat. The next day, the next Sunday, when my friend Dani was here teaching, we started a hike. And there was the second aliyah. We walked to Jerusalem. We walked from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. It took us 4 days. Day one was on a bike. And we walked from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. There was sleeping outside, camping, tents. It was tough. It was fun. It was amazing. It was, when I came to understand after 4 days with my wife and my two girls, was there isn't such a thing as quality time with your children and family. There's only quantity. Only just being a long time together and fighting and dealing with everything that comes up. That's what creates real depth and real intimacy and real quality. And we ended it in Jerusalem, in Yerushalayim. And so that was their second aliyah. They did an aliyah to the sacred text and aliyah to the sacred town, to the sacred city. We finished it. We walked all the way to my parents' home. West, you were there, in next to Emek Rephaim, and we had sushi, and we were done. So that's the bat mitzvah. And regarding Israel and your elections, so interestingly enough, I think all the Israelis completely realized and accepted that Biden won. I don't know of any Israeli that questioned the victory of Biden. There were some embarrassing moments. There were some very public Israelis that couldn't pronounce his name correctly. Someone said, I don't want to embarrass him, called him John Biden. There were some issues, but all the Israelis recognized that Biden won, that Trump lost. And my feeling personally is that there's a lot of potential. There could be a lot of openings I personally hope that Biden, that on the one hand, he wants movement on the Palestinian front. And on the other hand, he's the graduate of an administration, the Obama administration, that failed in solving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. That combination of the experience of failure and the will to do something will open his mind to new ideas. And as some of you know, we're working on some of these kind of ideas, what we call shrinking the conflict. We hope this administration will find interesting.
Good. Thank you. So beautiful intro. And now tell us about this book that virtually nobody on the screen has ever read.
Okay, so this book, Daniel, is a book that it's not a very long book, okay? It's 12 chapters long. And now I think it should be divided into two parts. Part 1 is from 1 to 6, and part 2 from 7 to 12. And part 1 is like the biography of Daniel, what he went through in life. Part 2 is the visions of Daniel. He had very enigmatic, very graphic visions. If anybody ever studied like the vision of Ezekiel chapter 1, Ma'aseh Merkavah, it's a very graphic vision. So Daniel has many of those. So I chose to discuss Daniel part 1, from 1 to 6, the biography of Daniel, and not the images, the mystical experiences, the visions of Yechezkel. That we're not doing today. Because there I think you have to do one image at a time, and it's a whole world. But I do think there's an interesting narrative in his biography. So what I'll do now is before we dig deep, let's first tell the basic narrative, basic story. I think Daniel's biography, the way it's described in the book of Daniel, is divided into 5 parts. Okay, so let's start with who is Daniel. There's some biblical history here we have to go through. So one, Daniel, as some of you might know, when we imagine the biblical narrative, towards the very end, the people of Israel sin. Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian king, comes to Jerusalem. They rebel. There's a rebellion against him. He crushes the rebellion. He destroys Jerusalem. And then all the population of Yehuda, of Judah, are exiled to Babylon. That's the common narrative. Am I right, Rabbi? That's the common understanding.
Yes.
But when you read into more details into the book of Kings, it's a little bit more complicated. There was a few kings. There's a king Jehoiakim, and then Jehoiachin, and then Tzidkiyahu. And then every one of these, during the life of every one of these kings, there's parts of the Judaic society immigrates to Babylon or is exiled to Babylon. Jehoiakim, Jehoiachin, and Nebuchadnezzar. So it's actually not a moment of destruction and exile. There's something more gradual going on here. And that is because the Babylonian Empire, when it comes to Judea, to Yehuda, to Israel today, and the first thing they do, they try to take the best minds to Babylon. Because that's what empires do. What empires like to do throughout history is when they capture a new land, when they conquer new countries, they try to steal its resources. Now, the greatest resource of the Jewish state was the Jewish minds. And Daniel was one of those minds. So years before, more than 20 years before destruction of Judah, Daniel was taken from Judah because he was a brilliant young adult. Or I think it was actually when he was even a child, they realized he was brilliant. And they wanted that mind to develop Babylon. So while they were stealing the best minds, they were stealing Daniel from Judah. And they take him to Babylon. So this is what Daniel is doing in Babylon to begin with. This is the exile that's before the exile. Way before the destruction, the exile, he's there. He's there, and that describes his life. So in the first chapter, it's described that he's there. He's not alone. He has some friends, which are also Jews from Judah, called Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah. And because they're some of the brightest people of their generation, they're cultivating them to be the scholars, the wise people of Babylon. Now, because the wise people of Babylon also know the different arts of magic, so that's what they're training. They're trained to be wise magicians. That's what Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah, and Daniel, they're like in a school for magicians, okay, like Harry Potter or something like that. They're training to be wise magicians for the Babylonians. Now, but it's interesting, in chapter 1, it's described how they refuse to eat the food that they're feeding them. It seems like they're feeding them like food that they believe is like brain food, that when you eat that food, you develop quicker and you're healthier. They refuse to eat it. They refuse to eat it because they're good Jews. I guess it's not kosher. And story number 1 is how even though they didn't eat the royal food, the food that's meant to cultivate brilliance, they were more brilliant than anyone else. That's story number 1, a classic story about Jews in the exile trying to be, on the one hand, a part of their surroundings, and on the other hand, holding on to their norms, to their principles, to their traditions. That's story number 1, okay? Story number 2, Daniel grows up a little bit more. And I just want to pause and realize what we're doing now. I'm telling the story just as with no depth, just so we could, just our first acquaintance with Daniel's biography. So part 2 is like this. Nebuchadnezzar has a dream, and the dream troubles him very much. And he wants his wise people surrounding him to solve the dream, to tell him, what was his dream about? What are the gods trying to communicate to him? So all the wise people tell Nebuchadnezzar, the king, hey, tell me your dream. We'll solve it. Nebuchadnezzar says something very interesting. No, you have to solve my dream without me telling you my dream. What you have to do is to guess what my dream was. And only if you could repeat my dream will I be able to trust your solution to the riddle of my dream. So they're like, we can't do that. Just tell us your dream. No, you have to you have to guess what my dream was and then solve that dream. And then he says, and if you won't do that, I'm going to kill you. I'm going to kill all of you. All the wise magicians that surrounding me have no value. If one of them can't know what my dream was without me telling them. So they're all like, oh no, so he's going to kill us all. So the next day, they're about to slaughter all the wise magicians, the entourage of the king Nebuchadnezzar. And then the new guy, this anonymous new guy, Daniel, goes to Arioch, like the chief of staff, asks him, why are they killing us? And he says, well, nobody can guess his dream. And he said, you know what? Give me a shot. So he goes to Nebuchadnezzar and he says, let's not kill everyone now. Let's give this kid a shot. So Daniel goes to his three friends, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. He says, pray for me, pray for me. He goes home. He goes to sleep. He wakes up in the morning and he knows Nebuchadnezzar's dream. So it turns out Daniel had a dream. And in his dream, he dreamt about Nebuchadnezzar's dream. So it's a very interesting moment. Daniel's mind is where dreams meet. And he had a dream about Nebuchadnezzar's dream. And not only did he have a dream, he also knew exactly what the solution was. He approaches Nebuchadnezzar. He tells Nebuchadnezzar his dream. Nebuchadnezzar couldn't believe it, that this rookie, this young guy, that's not even from here, he's from Yehuda, Daniel, he knew his dream, exactly his dream. And obviously, because he knew his dream, he completely surrendered. He completely accepted the way Daniel interpreted his dream and explained to him, what does God want from him? As a result, Nebuchadnezzar literally bows down in front of Daniel. And he tells everyone that he's the smartest person. He has like the spirits of God are in him. He is unique in his gift and in his talent and in his wisdom. He's the smartest man living. This is an important compliment. I'll tell you why. Throughout the book of Daniel, I realized anyone who approaches Nebuchadnezzar always approaches him using the same title, Malka le'al machaye, which means the king that will rule forever, live forever, reign forever. Like the whole rhetoric around Nebuchadnezzar is that he's eternal. There's no boundaries to his power. Not in space, he's the ruler of the world, and not in time. He's the ruler for all eternity. Malka le'al machaye. And he says, and the people who surround Daniel say this also, echo this, that Daniel is the smartest person living. Now, this takes me, I think, to the basic setting of the book of Daniel. What happens when power meets wisdom? When Nebuchadnezzar meets Daniel, where the strongest person in the world meets the smartest person in the world. Keep that in mind. I think that is one of the main motifs of this book. What happens when power meets wisdom? When the smartest person meets the strongest person. Daniel meets Nebuchadnezzar. Okay, so because he solved his dream, he gives him power. He says, then you'll be my chief of staff, you'll be my number 2, and you will be the governor of Babylon. Boom. Now he's not only smart, he also has power, and he's now in charge of all the wise magicians. So this rookie coming from Israel now becomes the number 1 in Babylon, second only to Nebuchadnezzar himself, the governor of the province of Babylon. Okay, which takes me to the next story. The next story is, okay, what was his dream? What was his dream? Now, stay with me, it's a very weird dream. Nebuchadnezzar's dream that Daniel dreamt himself goes like this. He had a dream of a gigantic sculpture. By the way, interestingly enough, they call the sculpture Tselem, because Tselem is a sculpture. Human beings are statues, we're of God. And Tselem Elohim. And this gigantic sculpture, his top, the head, from the head to the shoulders, was made out of gold. Then the shoulders and the arms were made out of silver. And then when it goes a little bit more down, it's made out of copper. And then the feet are made out of iron. And then the toes, they're made out of combination of clay and iron. So you realize what's going on here. The more you go down, move in this sculpture from the head all the way down, the value of the material goes down. And then he had a dream that a gigantic rock comes, crushes the statue, and replaces it. So this was troubling very much to Nebuchadnezzar. What does this mean? What was this statue? What is this rock? What does it mean that it starts with gold and then silver, and then copper going down, the value of the metal goes down? What does it mean? And Daniel repeated the dream, and then he says, here's the meaning. He said to Nebuchadnezzar, the first thing he says to him, I'm not wise at all. All my wisdom comes from God. God that gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge for the. He is the source. It's not me, it's him. And it's very important for Daniel. He emphasizes this all throughout the book and overemphasizes this. He doesn't think that his wisdom is his. He does not own his brilliance. He received his brilliance. That's the self-awareness of Daniel.
Nice.
So after he explains that his interpretation is not his, it's God's, he offers him his interpretation. And this is his interpretation. Nebuchadnezzar, Daniel says to him, what your dream was about the rest of the history. The entire structure of history is wired into that statue. It's a symbol of everything that's going to happen. And here's how it is. The gold head and shoulders, well, that resembles your kingdom. And it's a great kingdom. It's the best kingdom. It's a kingdom of gold. That's the good news. The bad news, it's going to end and be replaced with a kingdom which is not as good, not as efficient, not as powerful, not as functional, resembled with silver. And that kingdom will be replaced with an even worse kingdom. And that kingdom will be even replaced with worse kingdom, which means the structure of the statue, the movement from gold to iron is the structure of history. And history, as opposed to what people think, history is not about progress. History is about constant regression. Everything gets worse throughout time. And then and we have like 4 kingdoms, and every kingdom will be worse than the kingdom beforehand. And then a gigantic rock will come. The image of a rock crushing the statue. That's God ending history and replacing human beings governing the world with God governing the world. Boom. That was your dream, Nebuchadnezzar. So, first of all, what did he tell Nebuchadnezzar? He told him something that he was the first one to tell Nebuchadnezzar. that his power has limits and his kingdom is temporary. It's going to end. It might be good, it might be gold, but it's not forever. And anyone that says to him, Malka le'al machaye, the king that reigns, that governs forever, and Daniel says, God told you the opposite. You had an image, and the image was that your power is finite. That's the image. That what the God of the heavens is telling you through your dream. The next day, I don't know if it's the next day, it's the next chapter. It seems like it's the next day. There's the following event. There is a valley called Dura, not that's very important. And Nebuchadnezzar builds a statue of gold from bottom to top, from top to bottom, the entire statue of gold. And he tells everyone when you hear the music, it'll be certain music, like, I don't know, da-da-da-da-da-da, whatever the music is, everyone has to bow down to this statue. And whoever will not bow down to this statue will be thrown into a furnace of fire. My assumption is, by the way, that there is a reason why there's a furnace of fire around. They just created this golden statue, right? So I guess whoever will not surrender to the statue will burn by the oven that created the statue. I think that's the way they're thinking. And remember Daniel's three buddies? Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah. They do not bow down to this statue. Now, Daniel is not mentioned. I guess he wasn't around. I doubt he did bow down. So I guess he wasn't around, but his three friends would not surrender, would not bow down to the statue. So Nebuchadnezzar says, okay, so throw them into the furnace of fire. They throw him into the furnace of fire. And Nebuchadnezzar passes by and he sees 4 images there. And this is creepy because they threw into the oven, into the furnace, 3 people. But he says he sees a fourth angelic figure in the fire there with him. Nebuchadnezzar says, hey, listen, take them out. What's going on? So they take him out and they come out. And not only are they all intact, they don't even smell of smoke. It's like exactly the way they were, the same clothing, the same hat, everything, nothing is burnt down, nothing, everything like the same hairstyle they had walking in, they have coming out. It's kind of, and Nebuchadnezzar said, and then he realizes that the people that do not bow down to the statue of gold also cannot be burnt by the oven, by the furnace that created the statue of gold. I want to pause here. So I have a theory, a very basic theory. What's going on here? What did Nebuchadnezzar try to do when he builds a statue of gold and tries to force everyone to bow down to the statue of gold? So my theory is, if we were all in the same room now, this would be a back and forth, but we're not. So let me just say, my theory is, Daniel told him that the symbol of the statue is history and gold is limited. And gold is his kingdom. Maybe what he's trying to do, he's trying to change his destiny. Maybe he believes that if I take a statue of my dream, but turn the entire statue into gold, they'll be like the Babylonians governing history throughout history. And maybe he thinks if everyone will bow down to that idea that the Babylonians are here forever, maybe that will turn into reality and those 3 Jews screwed everything. Maybe that's how, because I don't think it's a coincidence that after he had the dream of a statue with partial gold, which means partial governance, he creates a statue only of gold, forcing. So I think he's trying to change his destiny. Okay, now, which takes me to his second dream. He has another dream. And the dream troubles him very much. And now he knows who to go to. He goes to Daniel. And now they're not playing the game. Guess my dream, so I'll know you're the real thing. He already knows he's the real thing. So he just shares the dream with him. And his dream is like this. I had a dream that there is this gigantic tree. And it's a tree from earth to heaven and was filled with branches. And every bird in the universe had its own unique branch on that tree. And every animal on the ground had its own unique space of shade in that tree. Oh, I think it's without the animals. I'm confusing with Rabbi Nachman now, I think. So I think it's only for the birds. And then something happens. The tree is uprooted and it lands very, very far away. And animals start eating. It's like a very weird dream, and he couldn't understand it. And he asks Daniel, and Daniel says, the tree is you. You, Nebuchadnezzar. You're this great cosmic tree. And right now you're controlling the world. And everyone, all the countries, all the languages, all the people in the world can somehow rely on you. But it's going to end. And you personally will be uprooted, and you personally will be exiled from civilization, and you will be eating dirt, and animals will attack you. That will happen personally to you, Daniel says to Nebuchadnezzar. And then the next scene goes like this. Nebuchadnezzar is literally on the top of the world. He's on the roof of his palace, and he's looking around. I want to just read the word he says. And he says, Halodahi Bavel Rabta. This is the great Babylon, the Ana Banyata, that I built. This is Aramaic, that I built. And it's because of it's an expression of my endless power. And this is the problem. Like, you know how people can get high using drugs? People also get high from power. When you're exposed to your power, it creates a fantasy that you yourself have no limits. Just like my power has no limits, I have no limits. And at that moment, he finds himself out of civilization, on the ground. It says basadeh, like in a field, in an empty field, and for months eating from the ground, attacked by beasts. He became a beast. He became nothing, weak, has nothing. And at that moment, there is a moment where Nebuchadnezzar realizes that at the moment that he thought his power was endless, he lost all his power. He says to God, I realize all my power is from you. It always was. And once he realized that the power was never his, he's back on his throne. He's back in his palace. He's back in power. I want to stop here. There's still more, just to reflect, one reflection. We said that the book of Daniel is what happens when Daniel meets Nebuchadnezzar. What happens when the wisest person in the world meets the most powerful person in the world? Well, the book of Daniel has an interesting statement here. You're only wise when you realize that you're not. And you're only powerful when you realize that you're not. I'll put it in more words. Daniel thinks all his ideas are not generated by him. They somehow land on him. And only as long as he feels like his brilliance is not something that he generates, but something that he received, he stays brilliant. Only when he realizes that his wisdom is not his, it stays his. It's the same with power. When Nebuchadnezzar thinks that his power is created by himself, he loses his power. And paradoxically, only when he realizes that his power is not his, it becomes his. So that's a paradox of brilliance and the paradox of power. And they meet when Nebuchadnezzar and Daniel meet. Okay, the next episode is after Nebuchadnezzar dies. There's a king. There is another king, and I won't go into it now. But there's a king, a Belshazzar, and they're having a feast. They have a feast, And in order, they use what they use in their feast to eat their meat and drink their wine is the vessels of the temple in Jerusalem. Because Nebuchadnezzar destroyed the temple, and in part of the exile, he brought in the kelim, the vessels of the Mikdash. So in the time of Belshazzar, which inherited Nebuchadnezzar, I guess it's his son that inherited his power. So they're having a feast using the vessels from the Mikdash, from the temple. And while they're doing that, this is a scene which is very famous. A mysterious hand comes out and writes something on the wall. Now, they're all shocked. What was that mysterious hand? And they can't understand what was written on the wall. So someone said to Belshazzar, listen, your father had one guy that knew to solve all the riddles in the world. This Jewish guy, bring him on. So they bring him in, and he says, what it says there on the wall is, takel mane ufarsin. And what it means is the following. You guys are sinners. You think you're at the top of the world because just imagine the hubris of creating having dinner using the vessels of the Mikdash, because those vessels are what the priests of Jerusalem used to feed God, metaphorically, to serve God. So when you serve yourself with those vessels, the statement is, we are the God of Israel. And again, the paradox of power. If you think that you have all the power, you will lose all the power. That's what Daniel says to them. And surely, very, very quickly after that, a new king, Babylon crushes, and it's replaced with the new kingdom of Madai. And the king is a guy called Daryavish. And now there's the last story, which many of you know. The people surrounding Daryavish were very, very jealous of Daniel because of his special status around Daryavish. So they were spying on him. They were trying to find something, some dirt. They could tell the king that this guy Daniel should be fired, or in those times usually killed, and they couldn't find anything. So what they did was they asked the king to legislate a very basic law that all the people always have to pray towards the king and not have any rituals which are not directed at the king. And the king said, yeah, I like that legislation. He signs that legislation. And they spy on Daniel, and they realize that 3 times a day, Daniel, alone in his room, when no one sees, he has the window open, and 3 times a day, he prays to Yerushalayim, he prays to Jerusalem. Therefore, he violates the legislation, and as a result, they throw him into the lion's den. Okay, that's the famous story, right? But Daniel, but the king did not want to do it. He loved Daniel, but sometimes the law is more powerful than the legislator, than the king. So they throw Daniel into the lion's den, but Daniel is protected. He takes Daniel out of the lion's den, and he becomes very, very close to this king. Okay, that was a short summary of the first part of Daniel, which is the biography of Daniel. From now on, it's the visions of Daniel. Daniel will stay around until the next king, the Persian king, Cyrus, Koresh. So that was a very brief summary of the biography of Daniel. Brought to Babylon when he's a kid, impresses the king by solving his dream, becoming the governor of Babylon, and then solving his dream with a statue, describing history as regression. The king's trying to cure history through like this ritual. It fails. Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah are saved from the furnace. And then the paradox of power, the dream of the tree. Only when he realizes that he was never really powerful, he returned to power. And the story with the enigmatic hand, takel, mane, ufarsin. Again, the paradox of power. When they behave like they're so powerful, they lose all their power. And then finally, Daryavish, envy. The people try, and we realize that Daniel is a frum Jew praying 3 times a day to Jerusalem. Okay, that was a very brief summary. Now we have the narrative. I'd like to dig deeper into the narrative. Rabbi, is there anything I think I should, is there any loose ends I should be tying before we dig deeper?
Yeah, so I once heard an amazing teacher from Jerusalem named Micah Goodman, who did the 8th series on Deuteronomy for the Tikva Fund. And in the course of that, you said that the best interpretation of the Bible is the Bible itself.
Right.
And as I was hearing your narrative on Daniel, I was wondering if you could just comment on two things where the Bible, it seems like the Bible is commenting on the Bible. One is there's an obvious intertextual reference to the Joseph story and Pharaoh, where this nice Jewish boy, it becomes the number 2 to the king. There's also 2 dreams. It's also about power, losing power. And it feels like in some ways this is a subversive sequel. There's a writer in Israel who wrote a book called Subversive Sequels. It feels like one of these is a subversive sequel to the other, because you have infinite power and then it's lost, and you have infinite power and then it's lost. And it feels, I was wondering if you could compare the two, the Daniel story of power to the to Pharaoh and Joseph. And then the other one is, in your lectures on Deuteronomy, when you were talking about the king's legislation in Deuteronomy, I think it's Deuteronomy 17, you also talked about the paradox of power, that the king in Israel, as Deuteronomy envisions it, only has power when he doesn't exercise his power, but that when he holds on to the power, he loses the power. So if you could just kind of talk about those two intertextual references to Deuteronomy and also to the Genesis stories.
Yes, so the Genesis story is exact. When I say I want to dig deep, that's why I want to dig deep, Rabbi.
Right.
You're completely onto me. The Genesis. So in Genesis, we have a story about a kid that was stolen and taken to exile, Yosef. And then there is a king that has a dream, Paro. And by the way, just in case no one, people, missed this, this reference. So it says about Paro says Vatipa'em rucho, and which means he was very troubled by his dream. And in Daniel it says Vatitpa'em rucho. They're using the exact same distinction, Vatipa'em rucho and Vatitpa'em rucho. And no one can solve the dream. Pharaoh's closest wise, they couldn't solve the dream. Nebuchadnezzar's magicians could not solve the dream. And then the guy that was stolen as a child from his home solves the dream. And as a reward, he becomes the governor of Egypt or Babylon. So this is it's not a crazy midrash. This is a repetition of a story. Now, when a story in the Bible repeats itself in such an obvious way, so we have to ask, why does it do it? And here's my theory. The Bible never repeats itself to say, everything is the same. It's the opposite. The Bible always repeats a story in order to say this is not the same. You see, our mind it's very hard time to tell the difference between things that are different. It actually never notices the difference between things that are different. Like this is my mask, right? And I have and behind me is and look at your chair. And can you tell me all the differences between my mask and your chair? So what do you want from us, Micah Goodman? Why are you comparing the mask? Like, your mind does not compare a mask to a chair. But there was a mask, another mask, our mind will immediately notice all the differences. Because here's how our minds work. We need things to be not different in order to notice the differences. We need things to be very similar in order for us to see that they're very different. That's what the Bible does. It tells the same story all over again, not so we'll see how similar they are, but to emphasize the radical difference that's between them. So, what's the Bible doing here? When it tells us the story of Daniel, it tells the story of Yosef, what's it trying to say? So let's just refresh our memory about Yosef. How does Yosef understand the story of Yosef? The way he understands, if you remember when he becomes the governor of Egypt, And he thinks there's a reason why God made him governor of Egypt. And what's the reason? We don't have to guess. Yosef says, he's governor of Egypt to save his family. Lemechiyah shelachani Elohim lifnechem. Joseph knows there's going to be famine, and he needs to save Egypt because that's his political job. And he needs to save the world because that's his job. But his calling is to save his family. That's the reason why this whole thing happened. So I have the power to save you and feed you in a time of famine. Okay, so that's right, Rabbi, that's not me making up anything. That's the pshat. That's what it says in the story. That's how Joseph understands his story. Okay, now this is now going to become, I hope you're all sitting tight, because now it becomes dramatic. Daniel is there in the time of, in the very beginning of the governance of Nebuchadnezzar, from his second year. And from the very beginning, he became the governor of Babylon. We also know from Belshazzar that throughout the son of Nebuchadnezzar, yes, that the guy from the feast with the vessels, the people say to him, you know, your father, Nebuchadnezzar, had someone very close to him that he always listened to because he always knew everything, and that was Daniel. So we know that if he was there from year 2, close to Nebuchadnezzar, and he was Nebuchadnezzar's number 2 throughout Nebuchadnezzar's entire political career, that means he was close to him in the 18th year of Nebuchadnezzar. The 18th year of Nebuchadnezzar is when Nebuchadnezzar sent his army to attack Israel, destroy Jerusalem, burn the Beit Mikdash, and exile the rest of the people. It turns out that the number 2 of the dictator that destroyed Jerusalem was a Jew, was Daniel. What does that mean? And it's like the book of Daniel ignores it. Nebuchadnezzar, the destroyer of Jerusalem, his chief of staff is Daniel. And we know that Nebuchadnezzar destroyed Jerusalem because, even according to the book of Daniel, because the scene is that the vessels are bought, at Belshazzar, they're sitting there and enjoying the fruits of the destruction of Jerusalem. So the book does not ignore the destruction. It just never puts the dots together. Nebuchadnezzar is the king that destroyed Jerusalem. The number 2 of Nebuchadnezzar was a Jew. What do we do with that? And I want to give you, and why doesn't the book of Daniel say anything about that? Well, let me make it more harsh. Why doesn't the book of Daniel criticize Daniel? So I think it does. And the book of Daniel is the art of biblical critique. How does the Bible criticize its heroes? First of all, the book of Daniel loves Daniel for good reasons. But why did he, but how did the book of Daniel criticize Daniel for participating in the destruction of Jerusalem, or at least what could he have done? Stopped it. Nebuchadnezzar admired him. The book doesn't stop to exaggerate how much Nebuchadnezzar admires him. It became a legend that people told his son how much his father admired him. So this is the art. This is how, as you said, Wes, how we use the Bible to understand the Bible. You tell the story of Daniel as a repetition of the story of Joseph. And then because it seems like Joseph, there's an expectation created that he will be a Joseph. But it turns out he's the anti-Joseph. He is the opposite of Joseph. Joseph understood his role, his calling. He received power to save his family. Daniel received power. He could have saved his nation. He didn't. That's the purpose of repetition. Not to show that they're similar, but to help us notice how unsimilar they are. That's how the book of Daniel criticizes Daniel. By repeating the Joseph story and letting us all notice he ain't Joseph. He is the anti-Joseph. He did not use his position and his power to save the people. By the way, there's a third person that understood that the reason why she's in power is to save her people, and that person is Esther. Mordechai says to her, Mi yodea im la'et hazot higat lamachut. Maybe the whole reason you became powerful is to save your nation. Esther used her power to save her nation. Joseph used his power to save his nation. Daniel did not. So I think the book of Daniel is a critique on Daniel. Yes.
Micah, and yet Daniel prays 3 times a day, Shachris Mincha Maariv, to Jerusalem. So can you square that? It's not like he's disconnected from Jerusalem. Okay. He davens towards Jerusalem. In fact, he gets thrown into a furnace or into the lion's den for that. So how do you square that he actually cares about home, but doesn't take any steps to protect home?
Okay. So we have to reconstruct Daniel's theology. Daniel thought he's doing the right thing. Okay. And what is his theology? So first of all, we know something about Daniel. His understanding of history is deterministic. The way he interprets Nebuchadnezzar's dreams, and by the way, later on his own dreams, everything that is supposed to happen is going to happen. We do not control history. Which is, by the way, I think why the editors of the Bible decided that Daniel is not a prophet. He's a chacham. He's maybe inspired by God, but he's not a navi. Why? In the Bible, the prophets are not people that see the future. They're people who change the future. The basic theology of the world of prophecy is that the future is open, and our role is to determine the future, not to see the future. The prophets were not future tellers. They're future creators. When Jeremiah says the Babylonians will destroy Jerusalem, he's not trying to say the future, he's trying to prevent that future. When Yonah ben Amittai says, Od 40 yom v'ninveh ne'epachat, in 40 days the Nineveh is destroyed, he's not doing that to say, he's doing that in order for it not to happen. The role of the prophet is to make sure that the future he sees will not become a reality. That's most of the time the role of the prophet, to prevent a future from happening. Daniel doesn't see that way. Like whatever, God speaks to us and God sees the future and we cannot change that. So Daniel did not prevent destruction, not because he wasn't pious, but because he was too pious. He thought that surrendering to God means accepting history, not changing history. And that is why davening, praying, see, this is the paradox. The guy that prays 3 times a day to Jerusalem did not save Jerusalem. But it's not attention. Because he prays 3 times a day, because he was so religious, because he was so pious, because his entire understanding that your power is never your power and your wisdom is never your wisdom, because of that pious, mystical understanding of the world, he thought his role is to accept everything and not to change anything. Jerusalem was destroyed because, by the way, in a very deep sense, his theology wasn't a biblical theology, it was a Persian theology. He was an assimilated Jew. He completely bought the Persian determinism that you can't really change the future. You could only see the future.
That's the way in which it's different from Joseph, because Joseph, with the dream, says, hey, we can prepare for this. Take the fat years and the ample years and the harvest years and have the granary, and we'll prepare. I can do something to change history.
Joseph is, we have an image of the future, And now that image could guide us, and we can make sure that we could change that image. We could change that image. So relationship between, like, here's, by the way, the Daniel theology is what later on will be called, this is what many of our Haredi brothers believe. That God speaks to us in two channels. Channel one is the Torah, channel two is history. And just like we have to obey the Torah, we have to obey history. That's God's will. Whatever happens needs to happen. It's God's will. Just like we're supposed to obey the sacred text, and if it says that we have to eat kosher, we have to eat kosher. If something happens in the world, it's because God wanted it to happen. By changing it, we're going against God's will. So for the same reason, he prays 3 times a day to Jerusalem. Because he's just such a tzaddik, he's so religious. He's also so passive. He lets Nebuchadnezzar destroy Jerusalem.
He's the opposite of a Zionist.
It's the opposite of a Zionist. This is the Satmar Rebbe has a very, very powerful theology. The Satmar Rebbe. I mean, talking about Rabbi Yoel Misatmar. You know, in New York, you have Kiryas Joel.
Yeah.
So this is named after Rabbi Yoel Misatmar. And Rabbi Yoel Misatmar has a Torah called Vayoel Moshe. And in this he says, or maybe this is how I've come to understand it. Imagine history is like a bus. This is not him, it's me explaining him. And the bus has a bus driver. What is Zionism? Bus driver is God, right? And the bus is history. It's Jewish history. Zionism is people taking the bus driver, throwing him out the window, and thinking to drive the bus yourself. God governs history. Once we try to control history, we're throwing God out of the bus. That's what we're doing. That's how Rabbi Yoel said. So he said, the act of Zionism is idolatry. And I think Rabbi Yoel Misatmar, like this kind of theology, its biblical representative is Daniel. It's Daniel. And so which takes me to another point, Rabbi Wes. The Bible criticizes Daniel for being passive. It's a very subtle critique. It's by comparing him to Joseph. It's by forcing you are on it immediately, by forcing you to compare him to Joseph, and then to notice he is the opposite of Joseph. Why wasn't he? Or you only ask, why wasn't he a Joseph? Because you were almost forced textually to expect he'll be a Joseph. So it criticizes him. But on the other hand, it also glorifies him. Daniel is a book in the Bible. You see, you get to be a book in the Bible even if you're criticized by the Bible. Now, this is a great example of biblical pluralism. Even the person that's a personification of Persian determinism, or what you call anti-Zionism, the opposite of Joseph, the opposite of David, the opposite of Jeremiah, the opposite of the biblical world where history is ours to shape. It's not something that we surrender to. And we definitely have to be patriotic and say for brothers and sisters in Jerusalem, like Esther. No, he's the opposite. He's not. And even though he's that way, so anti-biblical, he's biblical. See, you challenged me, Wes, to teach Daniel. The last time I taught Daniel was 12 years ago, when Beit Prat was very, very small. And I had to teach Daniel, and I thought, what's the Torah of Daniel? Daniel teaches us how are we supposed to think about our Haredi brothers and sisters? On the one hand, they don't participate in history. They don't go to the army. Obviously, this is generalization, right? But they don't go to the military. They're not a part of shaping history, our history. They're saying, look, God shapes history. We're not joining. You're on your own. On the other hand, they pray 3 times a day, right? So they're from passive Jews. They are Daniel. And I use Daniel to say, okay, so on the one hand, yes, we criticize them, and yet they're a part of us. That's the Bible. The Bible criticizes Daniel and then canonizes Daniel. There is room for our Haredi brothers and sisters in our story. That doesn't mean we accept their way. So I think Daniel is criticizing Daniel, but canonizing Daniel says that there's a room in your Bible, which means in your story for people that are wrong and you disagree with. And I think this is an important voice. This is an important Torah. I use this to understand Charedim, but I think it's an important Torah in such polarized time. Can we see people that we know are wrong as a part of our story? Or is it a binary? If I criticize them, if I question their wisdom, if I think they're wrong, they're not my story, or if they're in my story, I don't criticize them. No, the Bible criticizes Daniel in an artful way, and yet canonizes Daniel. He's our story. Also, he is our story.
Micah, you taught this 12 years ago in 2008, and now you're teaching it in 2020.
Yeah, so I think it was 27. So it was 14 years ago. 14 years. Because it was after the war in Lebanon, so it's 2006.
Okay. Do you see it differently in any way now? I mean, what has 14 years changed how you read it?
Oh, I just remember I don't remember exactly how I read it 14 years ago. I just remember thinking that Daniel is a Haredi Jew.
Yeah.
And saying to my students that the Haredim have their own book in our Bible. They're a part of our Bible. I mean, I think the main part of the Bible is King David. That's mainstream Bible, right? We fight, we shape our history, we believe in our power. That's the Bible. But also Daniel is our Bible.
Micah, can you speak to one other quality about it, which you adverted to at the beginning of your lecture, but just said that it's there, but haven't really gotten into it, which is all the fantasies in Daniel, in the second part, all these florid fantasies that who can understand, all these Ezekiel type fantasies, because it does feel like the ability to spin narratives and counter narratives and fantasies and counter narratives and counter fantasies is really real. I mean, in America, we have two Americas, and they each have very different fantasies and very different narratives and very different stories. And so can you talk about just at a general level, the relevance of the second part of Daniel to the first part of Daniel and to the overall message of Daniel, all these fantasies or interpretations or parables or predictions that are, you have to be a super insider to get. If you're not an insider, it's Greek to you. What's the relevance of all that?
Of the second part of Daniel. So, well, in Jewish tradition, so Daniel meets all these different angels, all these interesting people in his visions. And I'll take Wes, I'll offer like a Maimonidean take here. What does it mean that there is endless images represent divinity? So in some, God is like an old man in Daniel. And then other images in the Bible, God is a warrior. What does it mean that there's multiple images for God? So Rambam argues that means that none of these images represent God. If there was one dominant image that represents God, so that would have become like the icon of God. But how do you break our tendency to imagine God? By offering inflation of images, many images, and they're all different images of the real thing, but we don't know what the real thing is. That's how we open Anim Zmirot, right? You sing Anim Zmirot, right, in temple, right?
No, yeah. We don't.
You don't?
We don't know.
I
mean, we know, those of us who grew up in Orthodox shuls know it, but we don't do it in our shul.
Wow! I would challenge you to teach a synagogue, and it's so loaded theologically. Okay. So the song here says God has many images, and He's not any one of them. He's not any one of them. But yet all we have is the images, so we'll make believe that the images are true. Literally, it's a song people say. And I think this is what the book of Yechezkel is about, multiple images. And now you ask about, but none of the images are true. And now you ask about our political reality. What happens when you have so many different representations of your reality? And it makes you a skeptic. There's nothing to hold on to. There's nothing to hold on to. So I would argue, Rabbi West, that our situation today is different than Daniel. And that Daniel is trying to create skepticism. There's many images, so don't believe in any of them. Believe that there is a mystery here. I think that our politics needs us to believe that there is shared truth, that there is something called truth and it's objective, and we should fight for it and uncover it and believe and share it, because that's the difference between religion and politics. When it comes to religion, we need to be beyond truth. When it comes to politics, we need to rely on truth. Religion is beyond language. It's about the mystery. Politics, there has to be something solid, objective that we share. And if our smartphones in our digital world is polarizing us to a level that we don't have even a shared truth, so I think it's fair to say that it's a real threat to our democracy. But here's the good news. I think we're not noticing this enough. I was afraid, like many of us, that if Biden wins, or if Trump wins, by the way, you'll have two Americas. The America that won would say, you won. The America that lost would say, and I think that's not what's happening. You have one America, just like it's not a secret that 75% of Israelis were rooting for Trump. Like it's the opposite of American Jews, right? 75% of American Jews were rooting for Biden, 75% of Israeli Jews were rooting for Trump. All Israelis realize Biden won. I think most Americans, even Republican Americans, realize Trump won, right? You know what that means? That even in this day and age, there is solid facts, solid truth, and we still have power. So I think I hope our reality, Rabbi West, is the opposite of the second part of Daniel. It's not only representations of something that we can't see. There's actually solid facts there. And I think even this crazy time, we're starting to share them again.
So, Micah, can I just ask to close on one last note that if you talked about truth and wisdom and power, etc. Can you say something about the theme of humility in the book of Daniel? Because what the two pieces of your analysis have in common is that the wise person is only wise when they realize the wisdom doesn't come from them. They have to be humble. And the powerful person is only powerful when they realize the power is not endless and the power is not forever and it's limited and the power doesn't come from them. Only when the wise realizes they got to be humble about their wisdom and the powerful has to be humble about their power can they be wise or powerful. So it feels like another intertextual reference is about humility, very Moses type of theme. Can you just kind of wrap us up with some reflections on humility in the book of Daniel and what that might teach us today?
Yes. So I'm a big believer. I think that what is testimony to true humility? How do you know to tell if somebody is truly humble? So Rob, I want to share with you something. I don't think that people that speak low about themselves are necessarily humble. Like, that rhetoric, I'm such a, when people can underestimate themselves, I'm not sure that is a true sign of humility. Actually, there's a position at Rabbi Yosef in Traktat Sotah in the Talmud, which goes like this. Somebody says there is a tendency there in the end of this Masechet Sotah, Traktat Sotah, where they try to glorify different rabbis. So they say Mishemet Rabbi Meir Batlu Moshle Meshalim. Like there's this guy Rabbi Meir, he was the master of metaphors. And he said, ever since Rabbi Meir died, there is no people that could create metaphors anymore. Now, obviously, there still is, but that's an attempt to say how unique and how great Rabbi Meir was. And then Mishemet Rabbi Dosa, Batlu Anshe Maaseh. Ever since Rabbi Dosa died, there's no more magicians in the world. There probably is magicians, but it's trying to say that after he died, there's no more magic because he was magic itself. And then they say, Mishemet Rebbe, the editor of the Mishnah, when Rebbe died, humility died with him. Batla anava mina olam. That's how humble he was. That when he died, there's no more humility. No one in this world is humble. And this one guy appears. His name is Rav Yosef. He says, He said, don't say there is no humility. There's me. Ika ana. That's what he says. Ika ana, 2 words. There's me. I am humble. Now, saying I am humble seems to us like an oxymoron. If you recognize something good about yourself, and so you're not humble, it's an oxymoron. I don't think he thought it was oxymoron. Because maybe humility many times is just recognizing who you are and appreciating who you are. So I think, here I'm following the great philosopher John Dewey, that the great signature of humility is curiosity. If you're like, what did you say? Why are you saying that? If you're curious, that is a great testimony to humility, because curiosity means you recognize that there's something that you don't know. You recognize that your wisdom has limitations. You recognize that there's somebody else you could learn from. Curiosity is an active form of humility. It's not what you think about yourself, it's about how you experience other people. And if you experience the world with curiosity, and I think the most dangerous part of arrogance is when you feel like you don't need to learn anymore. You've seen it all, you've done it all, been there, done that. And once you think you are great, you stop growing. But if you realize you're not great, you continue growing. And that, I think, is the chokhmah of Deuteronomy. It's the wisdom of Proverbs. It's also the wisdom of Daniel. So I think the greatest testimony for humility is curiosity. And I think that's exactly a world which is so polarized, a world where everybody has absolute certainty that they are right. Its main signature, it's lost its curiosity. I would say a humble right-winger is a right-winger that reads books written by left-wingers, that listens to podcasts of liberals. A humble liberal is a person that hears lectures by Republicans, realizing, hey, I don't agree with them, but I'm fascinated with what they say. And I believe that the best cure to a polarized world is not love. I don't know what love is. Let's all love each other. No, let's find each other interesting. Let's be curious about each other. And that, I think, Rabbi, is the greatest gift of our tradition to a polarized world, the gift of curiosity, that the gift of true humility, active humility, knowing that you don't know, wanting to know more, being interested in other people, not being trapped in yourself. That is true humility. That is active humility. And I think when you said, when things are tough, let's learn Torah, maybe what you said is, when things are tough, when we're so polarized, when we're so trapped in our own truth, let's learn Torah. Let's let the Torah liberate ourselves from ourselves. Let's cure polarization with curiosity, the active expression of humility.
Micah, we just cannot thank you enough. This is so gold. This is just gold, gold, gold. And we're so grateful to you. By the way, I think Amy, our next class is December 6th. Is that right?
Correct.
Yeah. And what I'd love to suggest, Micah, just as connected to this class, is that we do Nehemiah, because Nehemiah is a nice Jewish boy who's serving a Gentile king. You know, he's in Persia. And when he hears about bad stuff going on back in Judea, he actually doesn't daven 3 times a day. He goes back to Jerusalem to try to build the walls. I think that's another intertextual contrast. Daniel and Nehemiah are opposites of each other.
That's true. And no one knows Nehemiah. No one knows Nehemiah.
Yeah.
So it's in your genre of books no one ever learned, and we'll try to learn it with me. Great. I'm in. I'm in. I'm taking the challenge. I'm in.
Thank you, Micah. Thank you all for learning with us. And we're just so grateful to you, Micah. This is just like incredible. What does Sinai look like in the year 2020? It looks like this.
Amen. Amen. Thank you.
So much.
Thank you.
I want to thank again Amy and Brian. Thank you guys for hosting. And I want to thank all of you guys for learning. We will see you on December 6th for Nehemiah. Thank you, guys.
Thanks, Al. Bye-bye.